I'm David Bandurski, the Executive Director of the China Media Project. We're based in the United States, but our primary office is currently in Taiwan. So we focus on domestic media developments in China, increasingly also global China and China's efforts to influence the discourse globally, and also issues such as disinformation. Well, I mean, China's tactics are really complicated. So we've been really focused a lot, since our expertise is on China's media development and its media system, looking at how its media system and the political system is adjusting over time to accommodate changes in technology, media change, and also changes in the international landscape. So one issue that we've been looking at a lot more recently in the last, I would say, it's been almost 2 years, but this phenomenon is only about 3 years old as a policy, is how China is using the provincial level international communication centers, as it calls them, which are now new kind of regional centers to conduct international propaganda, or international communication, it sometimes calls it. It will still use the term external propaganda, which is quite an old CCP term. But this is an important trend because it ties into broader changes in China's media environment around digitalization. So increasingly, the leadership wants to create new media products that can be attractive in different global markets focused on different populations and hopefully gain influence. But this is just one part of China's strategy. So we look at a lot of different aspects of what we call going global. Well, I think we can start with some of the differences. I think one of the biggest differences is that a lot of China's tactics are really what I call cloaking. So the whole point is to ensure that China's actions and involvement in, say, it could be a cultural program, it could be a conference with a nonprofit, for example, that actually is backed by the CCP, but to sort of remove or cloak or disguise the links to the state. This is really something we see across the board, and a lot of the work we do is just kind of to peel back the layers and find out who is actually acting. Usually the conclusion's the same. There's just a certain set of actors. They all go back to the party. But this is really important tactic, and this tells us that they're not really conducting, in many cases, what we would call public diplomacy, which is generally open engagement with populations outside of China or in other countries and so on. So this is a big character, and part of this too is also, and we follow this quite a bit, are different forms of media engagement. So it could be content sharing agreements with media overseas. Increasingly also it's training of reporters in different neighboring countries and, well, countries all over the world to sometimes provide technical training, which is attractive if you look particularly at countries in the global south that need and really have a demand for basic skills like video editing and maybe use of some AI tools and so on, but also sort of propagating China's views of how journalism should be practiced, primarily state-centered view, and particularly how stories about China should or shouldn't be covered. I mentioned earlier the ICCs, these international communication centers. I think it's really important to be aware of how groups like this, and I was just looking at one, there's a center in Chongqing that has broad shareholding, a lot of partners. This include like China Media Group, which is a central level group, also local media groups in Chongqing. So they're very interesting sort of aggregates of different bureaus and state-linked companies and so on. And they're increasingly experimenting with their tactics. So these include launching accounts that may be, as I said before, cloaked on social media platforms. So I think this is something we really need to look out for. Sometimes we need to look closely at their own discourse and how they talk about their plans and their achievements, because this is where we'll tend to see what's coming down the pipeline, which can be harder to do. What are their plans for the future? And also a lot of boasting about what they're actually doing. That may not translate into real impact, but it does often tell us where they're acting. So even specific accounts, we can sometimes see what they've launched through these various centers. I think I mentioned the digitalization. There are more than 2,000 of what are called convergence centers in China. They're basically local centers for content production, and they're all geared to produce content that is basically for export, so part of their external propaganda apparatus. So I think this is what we're really going to see in the next few years. And then I think the last thing related to that is the extent to which and how they're going to bring in influencers. So we have a lot of private influencers. They can come from any country, and they'll increasingly be doing this sort of work for China. So a couple of examples there. It was a number of months ago that Fujian's local International Communications Center put out a call. It was like a jobs call, and said it was putting together what it called an MCN, which would be a multi-channel network. They often kind of misuse or use terms in ways we wouldn't use, but what they do mean by that is that they want to have kind of an array of accounts, and they mentioned that you should be first politically clean, you haven't had any dissident activity, but you should also have existing followings on social media. So they're looking for people who aren't necessarily in the system. They would say in Chinese, 提制内 people, but people outside the system that can work for this network. And that one is focused on Taiwan. So this is interesting. And then I just noticed too the network in Chongqing, the ICC, it's called the West International Communications Center, put out a call for 30 hires. So they're hiring 30 foreigners around the world. And this is just one center. So I think this is something coming down the pipeline. To some extent, I think this will not replace the typical propaganda overseas that China has done through central state media like China Daily and CGTN and so on, but it will complement it. In many cases, in fact, there's also vertical cooperation on these issues. Absolutely, I mean, there's absolutely cooperation. I mean, we know that we have higher level cooperation agreements that have been signed between China and Russia. I've seen in the past one of these agreements, I forget, the Chinese partner was the agency that was once called, we once called it the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television. So it's a high level, it's a central government agency that signed an agreement with its Russian counterpart. Interestingly, looking at that agreement, it really favored China. And you saw that China was really concerned with getting a lot of its own products, and some of these specific documentary films would be mentioned as part of that agreement to show these in Moscow and so on. And so in a sense, there was some oddness. It wasn't very reciprocal at all. It was kind of a question of what is in it for Russia. So it seemed that China was interested in doing this. But recently we had this news about Russia doing the type of kind of reporting, or what we say, journalism training, they would maybe call it, or influencer training with their own Russian influencers and so on. It looks very similar to China's tactics in having kind of delegations and fora and things like this to train them in ways of telling stories. So when I saw that, I wondered whether there wasn't some more direct cooperation and learning about tactics in between China and Russia. Another one that's not really been looked at are what are called Luban workshops. Luban is a famous figure in Chinese history who was like a carpenter. So unlike Confucius Institutes, which have been very focused, really a focus of when we look at what we might call FIMI, like historically, maybe a kind of overemphasis on Confucius Institutes, but no one talks about Luban workshops. And these can be on technical exchanges, so maybe with the Global South, it could be about certain types of technologies that are attractive locally and that China can provide, solar technology and so on. For Russia, one of the Luban workshops was on information censorship and manipulation and some of the technologies. And so we've looked a little bit about that. We have a report kind of in the pipeline, but that's very new. And at one point, I think there are probably other examples. I'll mention one more. I forget the name of the app, but China and Russia actually had a cooperative news app that you can download. We actually did it to kind of look at the coverage. But I think this was maybe more of a symbolic act. I think it was created by the China Media Group. I could be wrong. But it had Sputnik News on the Russian side, Russia Today, and so on. On the Chinese side, it was Xinhua and so on. But this was certainly a gesture of cooperation. And I think appropriately, the logo was for the news network was a chain. So maybe an unintended symbolism on their part. Impact is the hardest thing to measure when we look at these activities. So it's much easier for us to look at the internal discourse of the CCP. I was talking about this before, and how it sort of brags to the top. It's often looking at superiors and saying, look what we've accomplished. In fact, one of our better regular sources for what China does are its media responsibility reports, it calls them. So every media group in China has to do an annual kind of assessment of its work. And part of this includes, of course, political responsibility, which is basically how well they've conducted propaganda on Xi Jinping himself. But there is a section on external propaganda. So we can actually look at what they say they have done. What we can say, though, interestingly, they still really depend on Western and social media networks. So in spite of the fact that the leadership talks in very grandiose terms about creating a uniquely Chinese system of discourse and so on, when you look at their actual strategies, they're basically saying, we need to borrow boats for this. We need to use these platforms as though they cannot build themselves really influential platforms. I think this is kind of sobering, and we have to remember that we're now 150, 200 years after many of our hugely influential and still influential newspapers, magazines in the West. We look at The Nation, The Economist, and so on. To this day, China has no equivalent. It has no media that's truly influential internationally, in the sense that every politician everywhere has to read it to understand what's happening, that it can have its own commentaries and opinions that influence policies and so on. So we should remember this. But I think one of the biggest influences is what some call flooding or crowding the space. I think it's a kind of propaganda garbage that China puts out. We see it absolutely everywhere. And this is, to some extent, tactical. Just to provide a specific example of that, we have looked at a number of news wires. They're not always the things we might be more familiar with, like PR Newswire. But there are a couple of news wires with China-backed, based in Hong Kong, for example. And they will say that they have 2,000 plus media that are cooperating, and they may. So these could be media groups across Asia. And essentially what they do is they're a clearinghouse of content. And so you may be a website, for example, in a small city in Alabama, U.S. state of Alabama, that has city information for your, maybe a population of 120,000 people or something like that. And then oddly, you'll find this website has run Chinese content about the glorious victory against poverty. And they'll use words like glorious. It's clearly propaganda. Why did this appear? Because they subscribed to one of these news wires, and that content just sort of filled that space. I don't think people in Alabama really care. But is this impactful? I mean, it's a really, really kind of lowbrow approach to propaganda, but clearly they see some value. So is it impactful? I think in that case, we might say, well, it might be a form of impact that they report again to their superiors. They say, hey, look, we were in all of these news wires or all of these local publications and so on. They might even try metrics on how many people they might have reached and so on. But how directly impactful it is of policies and so on, it's hard to say. But their tactics are so varied, and it's such a huge enterprise that we still have to, I think, act and respond, assuming a level of impact and assuming that these strategies, or knowing that these strategies are always evolving and changing. The one thing I'll often say rhetorically to people is that in China, we have the Great Wall, obviously historically, but we have things like the Three Gorges Dam and China's high-speed rail network. Huge infrastructure projects are associated with China, but we can't forget that the largest, far and away, the largest infrastructure project that China has today under the CCP is about information control, about the Great Firewall, about its huge system of global propaganda and influence. Addressing them is obviously tough, but I think a number of things we can do. I think number one is what I call radical transparency. So I think any project that is able to expose these types of activities, as I said, one of their key tactics is to cloak these accounts so that they can't be labeled on social media. If platforms do that, it may be not clear that they're government-backed and so on. So to the extent we can do that, this is great. When we do that, that transparency can often be shared. And there was an example of this with an investigation we did into cooperation between U.S. Discovery Channel, which we should remember quite insistently that this is an American network. We focus on China a lot, but we need to look at home, at what our own companies and media are doing in terms of cooperation and so on. But they were working for a number of projects with Discovery Channel, which was essentially broadcasting propaganda content. And one of these was a film about how wonderful Xi Jinping is. And we exposed that, did an investigation, and showed even that the British company behind it was actually majority Chinese owned. When a film then appeared several years later on the Dalai Lama, and it was airing in Sweden, Swedish media already had the investigative stuff. So they got a hold of us to see and sort of repeat the investigations we had done into the ownership of that company that was behind it. So that's just one small example, I think, of how we can use transparency to create awareness of these issues, and hopefully under awareness within our broader populations, which I think is number two. We need to work a lot more to make our insights on these types of issues, FIMI, and all other sorts of tactics that undermine information integrity. We have to take these to the broader public. It's great that we have forums, including one here in Brussels, but we need to find ways ourselves to be more savvy media people and communicate these issues more broadly.